The night had fallen over Harlem like a velvet curtain, but it was anything but quiet. Somewhere between 135th and Lenox Avenue, the hum of neon signs mixed with the distant wail of a saxophone, weaving a restless rhythm that spoke of ambition, desire, and power. It was the kind of night where reputations were tested, and only the careful, the bold, and the disciplined could navigate the streets without leaving a piece of themselves behind. He stood in the shadows of a narrow alley, trenchcoat pulled tight against the December chill, eyes scanning the dimly lit streets with the patience of a man who had learned to wait for the exact moment when history demanded action. His hand rested lightly on the object at his side, an extension of authority rather than mere protection. Every muscle in his body was taut, ready, precise. He was not here for chance. He was here for purpose. The crowd at the corner club had been louder just an hour ago, but now the voices were cautious, hushed, as if instinctively aware that something significant had been set into motion. Word traveled fast in Harlem. Challenges to the king were rare, but they came in waves, and tonight a wave had surged far enough to warrant attention. He could feel it in the air, the weight of unseen eyes, the tension that made even the most confident men hesitate mid-step. Across the street, a man moved too quickly, too arrogantly, believing the street belonged to no one. He was wrong. The king had a reach that extended beyond his own presence, carried through loyal men who understood the balance of respect and power. One miscalculation tonight would remind every observer why that balance existed. The man's breath came in measured pulls, fog curling from his lips, but there was no fear. Not yet. Fear would come. Fear always came, eventually. His loyalty had been tested before, his patience measured against countless provocations. But this night was different. This night was precise. The signal had been given. The order understood. And then it happened. The shot rang out, short, sharp, unmistakable. It didn't scream through the streets, it punctuated them. Windows rattled, glass trembled on bar counters, men froze mid-conversation. A silence fell so heavy it could have been carved into the brick walls themselves. The alley held its breath. The city itself seemed to pause, waiting to see how the king would respond. But Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. He simply allowed the sound to hang in the air like a monument to authority. Others would tremble, others would whisper. But he remained the calm at the eye of a storm he had learned to command decades before. The bodyguard lowered his arms slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself demanded ceremony. His eyes met the king's across the alley, a subtle, silent exchange passing between them. It was understood. The streets had been reminded, the lesson delivered. No more words were necessary. Outside, the murmurs had already begun. People began to speak in hushed tones, piecing together the story. Someone had challenged Harlem's king, and the consequences had been swift, surgical, precise. Respect had been enforced, loyalty demonstrated. And from that moment, the city remembered, not the bullet, not the confrontation, but the authority it symbolized. Bumpy Johnson walked into the night, coat brushing against the cold wind. He moved with the kind of measured calm that drew attention without demanding it. Every step was deliberate, every glance purposeful. The bodyguard followed, silent, a shadow tethered to a legend who had mastered the delicate art of maintaining order without overextension. This wasn't chaos. This was control. every man, every crew, every whisper in Harlem would understand it soon enough. And for those who didn't, the memory of the night would find them in their own way, through respect, through caution, through the subtle acknowledgement that in this city, authority was not optional. To understand why one shot echoed farther than any insult, any betrayal, one had to understand Harlem and the man who ruled it. Bumpy Johnson was more than a gangster. He was a strategist, a negotiator, a king whose power radiated beyond his immediate presence. The streets, the clubs, the numbers houses, even the Italian families operating in Harlem, all acknowledge the unspoken truth. Challenge him, and you risked more than defeat. You risked erasure from the narrative of the city itself. The shot that night did more than mark a single confrontation. It rewrote the boundaries of influence. It reminded every observer, every potential challenger, and every ally that loyalty had value, and that discipline had consequences. In Harlem, history wasn't written on paper. It was written in presence, action, and the quiet yet undeniable demonstration of authority. And for the man who had pulled the trigger on Bumpy Johnson's orders, it was the moment that transformed him from a shadow into a symbol. He wasn't acting for himself. He was acting as an extension of the legend. And in that precise alignment of timing, loyalty, and consequence, the streets learned a lesson they would never forget. The night swallowed the sound, leaving only the hum of the city and the awareness that a single act, executed with precision, could shift the balance of power forever. The morning after, Harlem moved differently, not louder, not chaotic, but with a careful, deliberate rhythm. Storefronts opened their shutters with quiet acknowledgement. Corner boys lingered a little longer, their movements cautious, measured, as if testing the temperature of the streets. Word of the previous night's event traveled faster than any official report ever could. Barber shops buzzed with whispers. Jazz clubs carried hushed conversations between songs. And the stoops of brownstones became stages for retelling the story of a shot that had rewritten the rules. Bumpy Johnson did not rush to claim credit. He had never needed to. His authority was neither loud nor ostentatious. It was earned through decades of careful navigation, precise action, and the understanding that power demanded respect, not performance. The streets knew who he was, and last night had simply reinforced it. He walked along Lenox Avenue, cigar glowing faintly in the crisp winter air. Men stepped aside, not out of fear alone, but from recognition. Each nod, each subtle shift was an acknowledgement of the invisible line that no one dared cross. Behind him, his bodyguard moved like a shadow made flesh, disciplined, patient, a living testament to the message delivered. The man who had executed the shot understood something many never did. Authority was not about individual flair. It was about alignment, precision, and loyalty executed without hesitation. The story of the night spread beyond mere whispers. Even Italian operators who maintained their own codes of respect and negotiation began adjusting their strategies. They did not respond with immediate aggression. They responded with calculation. A challenge had been made, and it had been met, not by the king himself, but by a man acting on his orders. The signal was unmistakable. The reach of Bumpy Johnson was far greater than a single person's presence. Inside one of Harlem's quieter clubs, a small crowd gathered. Frankie Slim Carter leaned against the bar listening as two older men recounted the events with a sort of awe reserved for moments that transcended the ordinary. "You saw it?" Frankie asked, voice low. One man shook his head, eyes wide. "I didn't have to. I heard it. One shot. And everyone stopped. You could feel it, man. Even the cops outside, they knew. You didn't move for a minute. That alley felt different, like the city itself knew something had changed." Slim nodded slowly. He had seen Bumpy's authority before, but the night's events were different. There was a precision in the act, a clarity of purpose that marked the difference between chaos and control. It wasn't fear that ruled Harlem. It was measured action, delivered with certainty. Bumpy Johnson understood this. He had spent years orchestrating a delicate balance between respect and intimidation, loyalty and consequence. Harlem was a living organism, and he was its unspoken architect. Every numbers runner, every shopkeeper, every club owner had been taught over time that actions spoke louder than words. And last night, a single action had spoken volumes. The bodyguard, silent as always, understood the weight of what had occurred. In the eyes of the streets, he was no longer just a man who followed orders. He was an extension of the legend, a proof that loyalty and discipline could enforce authority as effectively as any words or threats. The first bullet, so precisely delivered, had become a marker in Harlem's history. The second, had it been necessary, would not have been. Even those who had survived the encounter carried the invisible mark. A minor operator named Frankie Malone had thought he could push boundaries, test limits, and walk away unscathed. After the shot, he moved differently. He spoke differently. He existed within the newly reinforced rules of the street, understanding that challenge came at a cost beyond immediate injury. It carried humiliation, social consequence, and a permanent record in the collective memory of the community. By mid-morning, Bumpy convened a discreet meeting with his inner circle. Smoke curled lazily from cigars, filling the room with the familiar scent of authority. Lieutenants leaned forward, curiosity tempered by experience. "The streets heard the shot," Bumpy said, voice low, measured, "and they understood. But understanding isn't enough. Respect must be reinforced every day. Loyalty is demonstrated, not assumed. Authority is maintained through action, not just presence." One younger lieutenant, ambitious and restless, asked, "Do we expect retaliation? Someone bold enough might try something." Bumpy exhaled slowly, letting the cigar smoke drift upward. "Maybe, but anyone bold enough to test us again will already be calculating their own failure. The lesson has been delivered. History has been written. Now it's observed." Outside, Harlem's streets responded instinctively. Corner boys no longer swaggered without calculation. Numbers runners approached their work with humility, and rival crews began reconsidering their ambitions. Authority had been reaffirmed, not through chaos, but through precision, discipline, and timing. Even law enforcement, usually immune to street politics, noted the shift. Officers who had once viewed Harlem's operators with detached suspicion now approached with caution. They did not understand the legend fully, but they understood the principle. Loyalty, when executed with skill, could enforce authority beyond the reach of any single man. The shot that echoed through the alley did more than enforce discipline. It rewrote expectations. Authority had moved from abstract to tangible, measured not in words, but in consequence. In Harlem, lessons were learned quickly, and memory served as the most effective enforcement tool. By the afternoon, the streets had absorbed the rhythm of change. Life resumed, but with a subtle, pervasive tension. Men moved with careful purpose, women whispered quietly about what they had witnessed or heard, and the city itself seemed to acknowledge a new equilibrium. Bumpy Johnson had not needed to raise his hand. His presence, reinforced by the precise action of his loyal bodyguard, sufficed. In every interaction that followed, the message lingered. Loyalty carried weight, disrespect had consequences, and authority, when executed through disciplined action, was absolute. The evening descended over Harlem with its familiar mix of lamplight and cigarette smoke, jazz notes curling into the streets from nearby clubs, and the subtle hum of the city that never truly slept. But something had shifted. Even the night itself seemed to pause, waiting for signs of the ripple caused by the point-blank shot. Men who had been reckless hours before now measured their steps. Conversations carried a quieter edge, punctuated by subtle glances toward the corners where Bumpy Johnson's men patrolled. The story of the bullet traveled faster than any song in a nightclub or word in the papers. It was etched into memory before it even reached the next ear. The man who had been targeted, once brazen, now avoided eye contact and moved with the careful gait of someone recalculating every decision in real time. Survival in Harlem wasn't just about avoiding harm. It was about internalizing lessons, about learning that the consequences of disrespect extended beyond pain. The street remembered every detail. The smoke hanging in the alley, the calm precision of the bodyguard, the way the sound cut through conversation like a bell-marking judgment. Bumpy Johnson walked among his people that night, as he always did, calm, deliberate, never hurried. His presence was a rhythm of authority, a beat that dictated how men moved, how they spoke, and how they calculated risk. The bodyguard remained close, a silent extension of the king's will, embodying every lesson delivered by last night's decisive action. They passed storefronts, stoops, and small clubs. People stepped aside instinctively, not out of panic, but out of recognition. This was more than fear. This was respect earned and reinforced through proof. Inside a dimly lit club on 138th Street, Frankie Malone sat nursing a drink, still absorbing the events. He had always been ambitious, reckless, the type to push boundaries and test limits. But the previous night's demonstration had recalibrated something deep within him. He understood, at least partially, the meticulous orchestration that allowed a single shot to reshape the behavior of an entire neighborhood. "I don't know how he does it," Frankie muttered to a friend, eyes flicking toward the entrance, half expecting the shadowy bodyguard to appear. He doesn't even raise his voice, doesn't even step forward himself. And yet, everything changed, just like that. He snapped his fingers quietly. His friend nodded, voice low. "It's not just the man. It's the precision, the timing. You make a mistake with him, it's not just a loss. It's a lesson for the whole city." Across the neighborhood, similar murmurs began to surface. Shopkeepers and barbers, men who had watched the rise of Harlem's king for years, now spoke of the night in hushed reverence. The point-blank shot had become legend before sunrise. Conversations over coffee, during lunch breaks, and after hours in small apartments carried the narrative like sacred text. Authority, they realized, could be conveyed not just in presence, but in precise, undeniable action. Meanwhile, Bumpy convened his lieutenants for an evening council. Smoke-filled air, a low hum of quiet anticipation, and the unspoken weight of history settled in the room. This was the rhythm of power, carefully measured, deliberate, and understood by every man who knew the streets. The shot, Bumpy began, calm, measured, was more than a warning. It was a demonstration. We operate in a world where respect is earned, and any challenge to that respect cannot go unanswered. His eyes scanned the room, dark and piercing. We maintain order, not through chaos, not through shouting, but through clarity of action. Every man who tests us now knows the cost. One lieutenant, younger, ambitious, and restless, leaned forward. Do we anticipate retaliation? Someone bold enough might push back, thinking last night was luck, a one-off. Bumpy exhaled slowly, letting the cigar smoke curl upward. They might try, but anyone who does will fail. The streets have already witnessed precision, timing, and discipline. The weight of our authority now carries beyond our immediate presence. It is understood, internalized, and respected. Outside, the city reacted without a word. Rival crews approached corners with new caution, assessing risks with more care. Young men who had previously ignored hierarchy recalculated their steps. Even the police, who often operated on assumption rather than understanding, noted the shift. There was a subtle acknowledgement in their posture, a recognition that Bumpy Johnson's reach extended beyond personal presence into controlled, disciplined enforcement. The bodyguard, silent as ever, moved through the streets as a shadow of inevitability. Every glance he cast, every measured step, was a reinforcement of the lessons imparted. No act of aggression was necessary. The memory of the previous night's shot carried weight enough to reshape behavior, reorder ambition, and rewrite expectations. Harlem's rhythm had adjusted. Streets that had once pulsed with reckless confidence now throbbed with cautious respect. Conversations at stoops, in jazz clubs, and at numbers houses carried the undercurrent of the lesson. Authority, when executed with precise loyalty and discipline, could shape an entire city's behavior without a single word. By nightfall, Bumpy and his bodyguard returned to the King's quarters above Lenox Avenue. The city lights glinted off the streets below, flickering like distant candles. Inside, the air carried the calm of dominance that came not from loud proclamation, but from undeniable execution. The bodyguard cleaned his weapon with methodical care, every movement deliberate, every motion reinforcing the message that precision mattered above all. Bumpy watched him quietly. No words were necessary. Loyalty had been tested, authority enforced, and respect reaffirmed. The streets themselves had absorbed the lesson, internalized it, and would carry it forward for months, even years. The act was done. The consequence was understood. The legacy had begun. Even minor players felt the shift. Frankie Malone, once bold and brash, now hesitated before claiming corners or making moves. Rival operators in the Italian circles noted the change. Political figures and law enforcement officials recalibrated strategies, quietly, often without understanding the full depth of what had occurred. The single precise act had moved through Harlem like a silent earthquake, felt everywhere, seen by few, understood by all. The bodyguard, for his part, returned to shadow status. Silent, disciplined, and unseen, he was now more than muscle. He was the embodiment of enforcement, the living proof that Bumpy Johnson's legend extended beyond himself. One shot had communicated volumes. Loyalty executed with skill and timing could enforce authority more profoundly than threats, words, or numbers ever could. In Harlem, the rhythm of power had shifted, and everyone, from the smallest street operator to the most seasoned veteran, knew it. The streets had observed the consequences, internalized them, and adjusted behavior accordingly. Respect had been reinforced, not through chaos, but through precision. And the legend of Bumpy Johnson had grown, not through noise or threat, but through decisive action and unspoken authority. The following night, Harlem itself seemed to hold its breath. The streets were familiar, yet they felt different, as if the city had shifted slightly on its axis, tuned to the echo of the previous night's decisive act. Men who had once carried swagger now moved with calculated care. Storefronts opened reluctantly, eyes darting toward alleys and corners where shadows lingered. Even the jazz that floated from clubs sounded tempered, as if the city itself had learned to respect rhythm and timing. Bumpy Johnson walked calmly down Lenox Avenue, the glow of his cigar illuminating the contours of his weathered face. His trench coat swung lightly with each measured step. At his side, the bodyguard moved silently, a shadow tethered to the legend, a living extension of authority. The night was theirs to command, and every man on the street knew it. Tonight, the challenge would arrive. Frankie Malone had grown restless, a young operator emboldened by ambition and curiosity. Rumor had it he had been negotiating with one of the Italian factions behind Bumpy's back, testing lines, probing loyalties, seeing if the king's influence could be circumvented. But he miscalculated the weight of precedent. One shot, precise and point-blank, had already rewritten the rules. Malone waited near a corner number's house, cigarette dangling loosely between fingers, eyes scanning the street. The hum of the city was alive, yet every shadow felt like it could be another reminder of authority. He believed he could bluff, that charisma and bravado could substitute for respect earned through discipline. He was wrong. Bumpy's approach was quiet. There was no fanfare, no warning. He simply emerged from the lamplight, cigar glow tracing the line of his jaw, eyes locking onto Malone with the calm inevitability of history itself. His bodyguard followed, steps measured and silent. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken consequence. Frankie Malone's grin faltered the instant he recognized the two men. Bumpy. His voice was careful, almost deferential now, though he tried to mask the tremor in his tone. Bumpy didn't smile. He didn't step forward. He merely observed, letting the weight of his presence settle around Malone like a physical force. The bodyguard's eyes, sharp and unwavering, communicated a simple message. The rules had changed. The city had already witnessed enforcement in action. This was the test. Malone took a slow step forward, a challenge tempered by fear. I just wanted to, he faltered, words trailing. Every instinct in his body screamed to retreat, but ambition rooted him in place. Bumpy's voice cut through the night, low and deliberate. You know what happened the last time someone tested these streets? His words were quiet, yet each syllable landed like a hammer. You saw it, you felt it, and now you think you can ignore it? Malone's jaw tightened. Pride warred with reason. I didn't mean disrespect, just opportunities. You understand, right? Bumpy's eyes narrowed, piercing through the veneer of excuses. Opportunities are earned. Respect isn't optional. You learned that last night, whether you admit it or not. And if you don't remember, the bodyguard here will remind you without words. The bodyguard stepped slightly forward, a motion so subtle it could have gone unnoticed, yet it communicated volumes. Malone froze, heart hammering, realizing instinctively that any misstep now would carry consequences as definitive as the shot that had rewritten the night before. Bumpy continued, slow and deliberate. You want to test boundaries, kid? Fine. But understand this. Every action has weight. Every decision has cost. The streets remember. The people remember. And you're not special enough to rewrite lessons history has already taught. Frankie Malone's voice caught. I understand. Bumpy nodded once, subtly, a motion almost imperceptible, but waited with acknowledgement. Then move carefully. One miscalculation, and you won't get a second chance. Remember the alley, the sound, the lesson. Malone's chest tightened. Sweat prickled at his brow. He nodded again, this time with absolute understanding, and slowly stepped back. The lesson was internalized, not by fear alone, but by the clarity of precision, the embodiment of discipline, and the undeniable presence of authority. The bodyguard returned to shadow immediately, silent, vigilant. The demonstration was complete. The confrontation had required no chaos, no uproar, no needless escalation. A single, controlled presence had communicated the lesson. The city had absorbed it. History, in the form of streets and whispers, had recorded it. Bumpy continued down Lenox Avenue, cigar glow fading, the bodyguard at his side. The night held no further surprises, no challenges that dared disrupt the rhythm now carefully maintained. Every shop, every stoop, every street corner had recalibrated. Respect had been reaffirmed. Authority had been exercised with precision. And the legend had grown, not through spectacle, but through a masterclass in measured enforcement. Even as the minutes stretched into hours, the echoes of the confrontation traveled. Barbershops, cafes, and jazz clubs whispered of the night when ambition had met history. Men who had once questioned the king's influence now understood that power extended beyond presence. It was carried in action, in the weight of disciplined men who served the legend without hesitation. By the early hours, Harlem had returned to its rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, the city itself had been subtly rewritten. The memory of the point-blank confrontation, reinforced by presence and controlled action, became doctrine. Every operator, from small-time hustlers to seasoned crew leaders, internalized the lesson. Bumpy Johnson's authority was absolute, not because of fear alone, but because of decisive, disciplined enforcement delivered with clarity and inevitability. For Bumpy, the night was a quiet victory. The streets had spoken without uttering a word. Lessons had been communicated. Respect had been enforced. Ambition had been tested and redirected with precision. The bodyguard, ever silent, ever vigilant, walked at his side as both witness and instrument, the embodiment of the king's extended reach. The confrontation had ended not with spectacle, but with understanding. The streets would remember. Rival crews would adjust. Young operators would recalibrate their ambition. And Harlem itself, the living canvas of loyalty, hierarchy, and respect, had absorbed the lesson that would carry through every interaction, every negotiation, every decision for months to come. Bumpy Johnson had not lifted a hand, yet through the disciplined presence of his loyal shadow, a single controlled act, the point-blank reminder of consequence, had rewritten expectations, reinforced authority, and elevated the legend. The king's reach, the true measure of his power, was now palpable not just in the alleys he walked, but in the memory of every man who had borne witness, directly or indirectly, to the precision of justice executed without excess. The morning after the confrontation, Harlem moved differently. Not louder, not chaotic, but with a quiet, deliberate awareness that stretched from Lenox Avenue to 138th Street. Men who had previously tested limits now stepped cautiously, conscious of the invisible weight that hovered over the streets. The point-blank encounter from the night before had not only settled a challenge, it had rewritten the unwritten laws of behavior, codified in the minds of everyone who understood the rhythm of power. Word spread like an underground current. Barbershops whispered it between shaves, numbers runners murmured it over cups of strong coffee, and jazz clubs hummed with quiet conversation. "You hear about last night?" one man asked another. Bumpy's shadow straightened him out. No name needed. Everyone knew who him was, and more importantly, everyone understood the stakes. Bumpy Johnson remained calm, walking through his territory with measured precision. The cigar smoke curled around his figure, his eyes scanning every face, every movement. At his side, the bodyguard moved like a shadow given life, silent yet commanding. Authority had been enforced, and the lesson was clear. Respect was earned through action, not words. Frankie Malone had returned to his apartment, the memory of the encounter pressing against him like the weight of a stone. Every decision he had ever made now seemed reckless. Every prior act of bravado a childish gamble. He knew the streets had taken note, that his reputation had been temporarily tarnished, not by injury, but by a demonstration of controlled discipline that left no doubt who commanded the hierarchy. Across the neighborhood, small-time hustlers and ambitious newcomers recalculated. The story of the point-blank reminder traveled faster than any official report, faster than the police or newspapers could dictate. Street code didn't need to be written down. It was reinforced through living, breathing lessons. And the bodyguard's precision, the silent enforcement of the king's will, was now legend in its own right. Inside a dimly lit backroom of one of Harlem's jazz clubs, Bumpy convened a meeting with his lieutenants. Smoke lingered in the air, heavy and deliberate, as every man present understood the significance of what had transpired. "Last night changed perception," Bumpy said, voice low and deliberate. Not just with Frankie Malone. Everyone who thought they could push boundaries. They saw the weight of consequence. Authority isn't abstract. It isn't something you declare. It's demonstrated. And tonight, it was. One lieutenant, younger and ambitious, leaned forward. "They're talking about it everywhere. The Italians, the cops, even the shopkeepers. Nobody's doubting you now." Bumpy's eyes softened slightly, but never lost their intensity. They shouldn't doubt. But don't mistake silence for submission. Respect must be reinforced. Every day, every corner, every interaction. The lesson was delivered, but the story must live on. The bodyguard, silent as always, cleaned his weapon meticulously in the corner. His movements were precise, deliberate. Each gesture a testament to the discipline that had defined him long before the point-blank encounter. He understood the symbolic power of what had happened. One controlled action had ensured the balance of authority remained unbroken, and he had been its instrument. Outside, the community absorbed the shift. Storekeepers who had once whispered about rival crews now spoke cautiously, acknowledging the presence of order. Children playing in the streets learned in subtle ways the unspoken rules of hierarchy. Even the police, aware of the incident's repercussions, began to tread lightly, recognizing that Harlem had its own system of accountability, executed with ruthless efficiency when necessary. Frankie Malone's reckoning had only just begun. Word of his misjudgment traveled beyond Harlem's borders. Men he had once believed were his allies now regarded him with caution, understanding that his ambition had collided with the embodiment of discipline and loyalty. He had survived physically, but his credibility, his ability to maneuver freely, had been permanently altered. The streets had spoken, and the lesson was clear. The king's authority extended beyond presence, executed with precision through men who carried the weight of legacy as naturally as their shadows. In the following days, smaller tests emerged. Rivals tried subtle acts of defiance, delayed payments, whispered negotiations, but each was met with calm observation, presence, and subtle adjustments. The bodyguard, without a word, enforced the rhythm of authority. It was a reminder that power need not be loud to be undeniable. Discipline and timing were sufficient. Bumpy Johnson observed it all quietly. He did not need to intervene personally. The point-blank lesson had set the precedent. The bodyguard's actions had reinforced the hierarchy, codifying respect and obedience in the minds of the city's operators. The streets understood, challenged the king, and the consequences were immediate, precise, and unforgettable. By the end of the week, the impact was clear. Ambition was tempered, disputes settled before escalation, and Harlem moved with a cautious confidence. The narrative of the previous night, the controlled, decisive, point-blank act, became a benchmark, a living example of what authority looked like when executed with mastery. Even the Italian factions, always calculating, adjusted their approach. They recognized that the rules of engagement in Harlem had shifted. This wasn't reckless gangster bravado. This was the orchestration of consequence, carefully calibrated, historically informed, and impossible to ignore. Bumpy's legend, already formidable, had grown. But the bodyguard's role had evolved from shadow to symbol. His precision, his discipline, and his loyalty had become part of the story. A story that confirmed to every resident, every operator, and every outsider that Harlem's hierarchy was not just observed. It was enforced with intelligence, timing, and unyielding authority. Harlem, for the first time in years, had witnessed clarity. Respect had been communicated without chaos, and the consequences of miscalculation were as vivid as the night itself. The city absorbed the lesson, and it traveled faster than rumor, faster than gossip. One man had tested the boundaries of the king's authority, and through one decisive, controlled action, the streets had learned exactly where power resided. Weeks turned into months, and the story of that single night became woven into the fabric of Harlem's identity. What had started as a confrontation between one ambitious man and the king's enforcer had become a living lesson on power, loyalty, and authority. The bodyguard, once a quiet shadow, was now recognized, not openly, for his nature was still disciplined and restrained, but through the whispered acknowledgement of those who had witnessed or heard of his actions. Bumpy Johnson's reputation, already monumental, had ascended to near-mythic status. The city's operators, numbers runners, Small-time hustlers, shopkeepers, and even rival factions understood something fundamental. Authority in Harlem was not about threats. It was about execution. Presence alone could hold a block, but a single discipline act could rewrite the rules entirely. The point-blank reminder from the bodyguard had demonstrated that principle, and it resonated far beyond the alley where it occurred. In the months following, Bumpy continued his careful orchestration of power. He held meetings in smoky backrooms, oversaw negotiations with the Italian families, and moved through Harlem with his signature calm. Every gesture, every glance carried weight. But the story of the encounter remained a quiet yet potent force, influencing decisions and behavior throughout the neighborhood. Frankie Malone, once emboldened by arrogance, had learned the hard way. He moved with caution, aware that his miscalculation was now part of Harlem's collective memory. He avoided confrontations, settled disputes quietly, and recalibrated his ambitions. Those who had observed his fall now understood a vital truth. Testing the king or his enforcers was not merely ill-advised, it was a lesson in humility. Even the police, seasoned in Harlem's unpredictable rhythms, adjusted their approach. Officers who had previously tested boundaries now exercised caution, recognizing that the hierarchy Bumpy commanded was both subtle and absolute. Authority in Harlem did not always come from uniformed lawmen. It was reinforced by discipline, presence, and the ability to act decisively when history demanded it. The bodyguard remained the quiet architect of this new understanding. His loyalty, discipline, and precision became a symbol of what it meant to operate within Bumpy Johnson's domain. He did not seek recognition, nor did he need it. His actions spoke volumes. Every glance, every measured step, every silent observation conveyed the weight of consequence. Harlem understood him as the living embodiment of the king's authority. A reminder that precision, not bravado, defined true power. The Italian factions, ever meticulous and calculating, took note. Their strategies shifted, their negotiations tempered, and their movements measured. They recognized that the rules of engagement had changed. Harlem was no longer merely a territory to be tested or a prize to be contested. It was a domain governed by discipline, reinforced through loyalty, and defended through precision. The Bodyguards Act had codified the standard, and everyone who operated in the city had to adapt. In the community, the narrative carried a subtle but profound weight. Shopkeepers, residents, and younger men navigating the streets internalized the lesson without needing to witness violence directly. They learned through observation, through stories passed quietly between trusted confidants, and through the palpable aura of authority that Bumpy and his enforcer projected. Respect was now earned and maintained through action, and the consequences of misjudgment were tangible, immediate, and historically documented in the city's collective memory. Bumpy Johnson himself understood the broader implications. Authority was not static, and respect was not guaranteed. It had to be continually demonstrated and reinforced. The point-blank action was more than a reaction to a challenge. It was an investment in the longevity of his legacy. The bodyguard had executed that investment flawlessly, ensuring that the hierarchy of Harlem remained unbroken. The streets responded accordingly. Corner boys, once reckless in their maneuvers, now moved with deliberate caution. rival crews approached negotiations with tempered ambition, aware that missteps could result in lessons far more permanent than bruises or humiliation. Even those who had previously ignored the king's reputation now regarded him and his loyal enforcer with a measured respect that transcended fear. In the years that followed, the memory of the night remained a defining story. Barbershops and jazz clubs repeated it in hushed tones, not as gossip, but as doctrine. Young men who aspired to operate within Harlem's intricate network of influence were taught the story as a cautionary tale and a blueprint for understanding power. Loyalty, discipline, timing, and precision were the keys to survival. Bumpy Johnson's empire of influence flourished, strengthened not by brute force alone, but by calculated reinforcement of respect. The bodyguard's decisive act had validated a principle older than any single man. That authority, when exercised with intelligence and executed with perfect timing, was indisputable. The story of that point-blank act became legend, an exemplar of the mechanics of power, the ethics of enforcement, and the embodiment of loyalty under duress. By the end of the decade, historians, journalists, and those chronicling Harlem's history recognized the subtle but irreversible shifts caused by that night. Bumpy Johnson was not merely a figure of fear or ambition. He was a symbol of disciplined authority, and the bodyguard had become a legend in his own right. The streets remembered the lesson vividly. Loyalty executed with precision could reshape entire power structures, and consequence delivered with intent could rewrite history. Harlem never forgot that night, not in the loud clamor of the streets, not in the newspapers or the headlines, but in the quiet understanding of those who lived and moved within its rhythm. One man had tested the king, and one loyal shadow had answered with precision that transcended fear. The lesson was clear, unspoken, yet universally acknowledged. Respect was earned, authority was absolute, and loyalty executed with skill could define the fate of a city. Bumpy Johnson did not need to raise his own hand. His presence alone was formidable, but the bodyguard's action demonstrated something far more profound, a principle that even the king himself relied upon. Power multiplied when trust was paired with competence. In the alley, in the boardrooms, in the clubs and storefronts, the city felt the weight of that single decisive act. It was a punctuation mark on history, an indelible imprint that redefined how Harlem understood authority. The streets, always observant, internalized the lesson. Men recalibrated their ambitions. Rivals approached negotiations with caution. Community members understood that chaos was managed not by threats, but by discipline, by the measured application of force, and by the silent enforcement of respect. The narrative became legend, repeated quietly yet deliberately, a moral etched into the very identity of Harlem. This was more than one night, one bullet, or one man's loyalty. It was a demonstration of the mechanics of power, how precision, timing, and discipline could reinforce a legacy without need for spectacle. It was a lesson in leadership, in the unbreakable bond between a figurehead and the men who carried the weight of his authority. And it was proof that in Harlem, the rules were not negotiated. They were enacted, witnessed, and remembered. When the bodyguard stepped into the alley, pistol in hand, he was acting not as an agent of vengeance, but as the executor of principle. The streets understood instantly, and the city itself seemed to pause, acknowledging the shift in equilibrium. Respect was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, immediate, and immortalized in memory. Harlem had learned once again that true authority required more than presence. It required action, executed with intelligence, restraint, and precision. And sometimes it takes a legend and the loyal shadow who serves him to remind the world what respect really means. That night was not just a confrontation. It was history being written in the silent language of consequence. The king's reach, the enforcer's precision, and the city's recognition had converged into a moment that would echo through time. And for anyone who understood the streets, the lesson was eternal. In Harlem, authority was absolute, loyalty was sacred, and the consequences of challenge were never forgotten. That concludes the full script for Point Blank Fire at Harlem's King, the sound that rewrote mob history. In the untold legend style, complete with legendary pacing, historical realism, and cinematic tension.